In the 1990s, South Florida was filled with people chasing the American dream. But inside one gym, a small group of bodybuilders decided waiting for success wasn't good enough. They wanted wealth immediately, luxury cars, mansions, millions of dollars, and they were willing to do almost anything to get it. What followed was a chain of crimes so bizarre and brutal that many people struggled to believe it was real. This is the unbelievable story of the bodybuilder gang that targeted wealthy victims and turned greed into a deadly obsession. It was the summer of 1994, and Sun Gym looked like the kind of place where dreams were built one rep at a time. Walk through the front doors and everything seemed legit. On one side, there was a juice bar buzzing with people finishing aerobic classes. On the other, rows of heavy free weights and top-tier machines lined the floor. They even offered babysitting services for members with kids. But behind all that polished fitness club energy, there was another side to the place. If somebody knew the right people and asked the right questions in the locker room, they could get their hands on just about any illegal steroid they wanted. Sitting just north of Miami Lakes, Sun Gym had become the destination for serious bodybuilders. This wasn't the kind of place for casual gym goers or people trying to drop a few pounds before beach season. Sun Gym was built for men obsessed with size, muscle, and physical perfection. And right at the center of that world was Daniel Lugo, the gym's charismatic, fast-talking manager. Wherever Lugo went, his closest ally, Noel Adrian Doorball, was usually not far behind. The two first connected through a woman named Lucretia Goodridge. Doorball was her cousin and had recently arrived from Trinidad. Back then, he was struggling just to get settled in America. He worked as a fry cook at a Fiesta Taco in Kendall. He didn't own a car. Every day, he rode a bicycle to work. Over time, both men drifted into the fitness world and started working as trainers. Before long, they became inseparable workout partners. Then Lugo soon brought him into Sun Gym and gave him a part-time job. By January 1994, the 22-year-old trainer had invested $1 million into a Merrill Lynch mutual fund account. That raised plenty of eyebrows. This was a guy with only 2 personal training clients. He wasn't training celebrities. He wasn't running a major business, yet somehow he had access to $1 million. The obvious question was, where was the money coming from? The answer traced right back to Daniel Lugo. Shortly after getting hired at Sun Gym, Lugo met another weightlifter with a background that looked a lot like his own. The man had recently gotten out of jail and shared Lugo's interest in white-collar crime. The two quickly joined forces. Together, they created 10 fake medical companies and rented dozens of mailboxes around Miami. Then they began purchasing personal information belonging to Medicare recipients. For about $10 per name, they bought social security numbers, birth dates, and identities. Using that information, they submitted fraudulent medical claims to the government for treatments and services that never happened. Money started pouring in. Lugo kept most of it. His partner didn't complain much because, according to later statements, he became afraid of Lugo after hearing stories about him bragging that he'd hired a hitman to deal with a former business partner. When the partnership finally ended, Lugo moved the money into a mutual fund account, but he didn't use his own name. Instead, he used Doorball's. Lugo was still on probation, still under supervision, and still owed more than $70,000 in restitution. Putting the money in Doorball's name allowed him to keep the cash hidden while staying out of the spotlight. By the summer of 1994, Carl Weeks had reached a point in his life where he knew something needed to change. Looking for a fresh start, he arrived in Miami, where Sun Gym employee quickly introduced him to the gym's most influential figures, Adrian Doorball and, of course, Daniel Lugo. By then, Lugo had become something of a legend around the gym. Stories about his ability to make money seemed to circulate non-stop, growing bigger with every retelling until they sounded almost mythical. But when Lugo looked at Weeks, he wasn't impressed. Weeks weighed around 140 pounds, soaking wet, hardly fitting the image Sun Jim liked to project. Lugo told him there weren't any openings, at least not right now. Rumors were already circulating that the gym might be sold and hiring had basically frozen. Still, Lugo hinted that something could come available later. So Weeks waited. He stayed with Pierre and Pierre's young son while bouncing back and forth between Miami and New York. Most of his income came from public assistance and food stamps. Things got even worse when Pierre lost his own job at Sun Gym and ended up working at his father's dry cleaning business in Little Haiti. Meanwhile, Weeks spent his days sitting around wondering if moving to Miami had been a huge mistake. Then, out of nowhere, Daniel Lugo finally called. Lugo told Weeks to come meet him at his office. Calling it an office was being generous. The room was located inside an accounting firm owned by Sun Gym owner John Massey. When Weeks arrived, Lugo, Adrian Doorbal, and Stevenson Pierre were already there waiting. Then, Lugo got straight to the point. He asked Pierre and Weeks how they'd like to make $100,000 for just 2 days of work. That was the hook. Then came the sales pitch. According to Lugo, a businessman named Mark Schiller had stolen $100,000 from him and another $200,000 from Jorge Delgado, one of Sun Gym's regular members. The story was almost certainly fiction, but Lugo delivered it with enough confidence that it sounded real. He claimed they weren't just going to recover the money, they were going to take everything. Pierre already knew Delgado. The 31-year-old was a regular fixture around the gym, and everyone knew he and Lugo were close. Pierre had even helped move gym equipment to Delgado's warehouse in Hialeah, a place known as Speed Racers. That warehouse would soon become a major part of Lugo's plans. Lugo explained that Schiller needed to be taken down, and he wasn't talking about a lawsuit. The plan involved grabbing Schiller, taking him somewhere isolated, beating a confession out of him, forcing him to hand over his assets, and potentially killing him afterward. Pierre thought the whole thing sounded insane. In his mind, maybe someone should try talking to Schiller first. Weeks wasn't much more comfortable. He recognized immediately that this was exactly the type of trouble he'd moved to Miami to escape. But Lugo knew how to work people. He pulled Weeks aside and promised him something bigger. He told him that after everything was over, he'd personally mentor him and teach him how to make serious money. To a man struggling to rebuild his life, that promise hit hard. The resistance started melting away. A few days later, the group met again. This time, Jorge Delgado joined them, and if there was any doubt about where he stood, it disappeared quickly. Delgado was fully committed. He handed over information about Schiller's routines, habits, business dealings, and personal life. To understand why, it helped to go back a few years. In 1991, Delgado's life was falling apart. He'd quit his job selling cars, money was tight, and his family was struggling badly. His wife, Linda, worked for Mark Schiller at an accounting firm in West Dade. One day, she broke down emotionally at work and explained how desperate things had become. Schiller felt sorry for them, so he offered Delgado a job. At first, Delgado handled small errands. Eventually, he earned a title and became a marketing representative. Before long, the relationship evolved far beyond employer and employee. They became close friends. Then they became business partners. Together, they launched new ventures, including a nutritional supplement company and another accounting business. In many cases, Schiller even financed Delgado's share of the investments. The results transformed Delgado's life. Not long before, he'd been living with his in-laws. Now he owned a beautiful home near Miami Lakes. His wife no longer had to work, and they were preparing to start a family. Schiller trusted him completely. He trusted him enough to give him access to his home security code, and that trust gave Delgado access to everything. Then, in late 1992, Delgado walked into Sun Gym and met Daniel Lugo. What started as a trainer-client relationship quickly became something much deeper. Lugo became one of the most influential people in Delgado's life. Naturally, Delgado wanted to bring Lugo into business opportunities with Schiller. Schiller wanted nothing to do with him. Something about Lugo rubbed him the wrong way. Eventually, the tension became too much. Schiller forced Delgado to choose. It was either Lugo or him. Delgado chose Lugo. Before walking away, Schiller issued a warning. He believed Lugo would eventually bring trouble into Delgado's life. As 1994 continued, Lugo began feeding Delgado a steady stream of manipulation. Delgado's wife was pregnant, and Lugo constantly framed everything through that lens. Soon, the discussion wasn't about recovering a supposed $200,000 loss anymore. It became about taking everything Schiller owned. With the plan growing more ambitious by the day, the crew visited the spy shop on Biscayne Boulevard. The place was owned by a born-again Christian named John Demeter. The irony was hard to miss. Under giant signs promoting faith and salvation, the group shopped for equipment designed to shock, restrain, track, and spy on people. To avoid suspicion, they pretended they were security personnel for a touring rock band. Using that cover story, the group began gathering what they believed they would need for the operation. They bought tasers, handcuffs, and Motorola radios that allowed them to communicate privately. Then they arranged transportation. Lugo rented a burgundy Ford Astro van, which would be used to track Mark Schiller's movements, conduct surveillance, and eventually transport him to Delgado's warehouse. During many of those surveillance runs, Weeks and Pierre stayed hidden in the back of the van. They knew that two black men repeatedly driving through an affluent South Florida neighborhood would draw police attention almost immediately. But despite all the planning, the operation was a disaster. One kidnapping attempt after another fell apart, and morale started to crater. He'd gather everybody up and take them to Miami's famous Solid Gold Club. There, he'd hand out cash, buy drinks, and keep selling the dream. And every time doubt started creeping into the crew's minds, Lugo reminded them of the same thing. If they could pull off the Schiller job, the life they were chasing would finally be theirs. It was 9 a.m. on the morning of November 14th, 1994. The plan seemed simple enough. Daniel Lugo parked his Toyota Camry in an alley beside Schiller's Schlotsky's Deli, boxing in Schiller's Toyota 4Runner. Once Schiller was trapped, the van would rush in, the crew would pull him from his vehicle, overpower him, and haul him away. At least that was the idea. Instead, Schiller sat trapped in the alley, leaning on his horn while staring at the Camry with heavily tinted windows blocking his path. Then the radio crackled. The van wouldn't start. Another mission down the drain. Back at the Miami Lakes office, Lugo exploded. After weeks of failed surveillance, failed planning, and failed kidnappings, he'd had enough. He announced that the operation was finished. As far as he was concerned, he could always go back to making money through Medicare fraud. If the rest of the crew wanted a good Christmas, they would have to grab Schiller themselves. Doorball and Weeks took those words personally. The way they saw it, they had just been called out by their captain. Their pride was on the line, and they already knew who they blamed for all the failures, Stevenson Pierre. The moment they left Lugo's office, they dropped Pierre off at home and effectively removed him from the operation. From that point forward, they knew they needed someone else. Their next target for recruitment was Mario Sanchez. Later that day, Doorball approached Sanchez at the gym and asked him to step outside. Once Sanchez climbed in, Doorball made his pitch. He claimed they needed an intimidating guy to help collect money from a drug dealer who owed a debt. According to Doorball, the job would take only one afternoon and pay $1,000, but Sanchez wasn't buying it. The story immediately raised red flags, and he wanted to know exactly what kind of drug dealer they were supposedly dealing with. Not long afterward, Doorball and Weeks showed up at Sanchez's apartment unannounced. Even then, Sanchez wasn't sold. He wanted reassurance that nobody was going to get hurt. Doorball kept downplaying everything. According to him, Sanchez wouldn't have to do much of anything. He just needed to stand around, look intimidating, and help settle a debt. Eventually, Sanchez agreed. Christmas was coming. He wanted money for his son. and $1,000 was hard to ignore. Mark Schiller was dealing with problems that seemed completely normal compared to what was about to happen. He was sitting inside his Schlotsky's deli, waiting for a potential buyer who had expressed interest in purchasing the struggling business. Meanwhile, sitting quietly in the parking lot were Doorbal, Weeks, and Sanchez, waiting. By 4 o'clock, Schiller finally accepted that the buyer wasn't coming. Disappointed, he walked outside toward his forerunner. The crew made their move. They hit him with tasers almost immediately. As he fought and screamed, they dragged him across the parking lot toward the waiting van. Then the van simply pulled away. As the van rolled through Miami, the kidnappers stripped Schiller of anything valuable he had on him. Then the abuse escalated. They covered him with a moving blanket and repeatedly shocked his heel with tasers. Each jolt brought another wave of agony. By the time the van finally came to a stop, Schiller was barely conscious. A voice near the front announced that the Eagle had landed. Schiller didn't know it yet, but they had just arrived at Jorge Delgado's warehouse. Over the following days, the kidnappers forced him to tell business associates a bizarre story. According to the script, he had fallen hopelessly in love with a young Cuban woman named Lillian Torres. Supposedly, he was liquidating his businesses, cashing out his assets, and preparing to disappear with her forever. It sounded ridiculous, but the kidnappers kept pushing it. At the same time, they forced him to sign stacks of documents. Blindfolded and bleeding from the tape wrapped around his face, Schiller had no idea what he was signing. Every signature felt like another piece of his life disappearing. But while his captors thought he was helpless, Schiller was paying attention. Little by little, he began identifying people. One voice stood out immediately: Daniel Lugo. The unique combination of a New York accent and distinctive speech pattern made him impossible to miss. Another realization hit even harder. The kidnappers knew too much, and only one person could have provided all of that: Jorge Delgado. As the days dragged on, Schiller pieced together more details. Lugo rarely stayed around during the day because he was on probation and needed to maintain appearances at Sun Gym. Among all the men guarding him, Schiller found two who occasionally showed him some humanity: Carl Weeks, whom the crew called Sparrow, and Stevenson Pierre, known as Napoleon. Pierre had reportedly returned to the operation only after threats were made against his son. Whenever Schiller got food, water, cigarettes, or even a little kindness, it usually came from those two. The days turned into weeks. What the kidnappers thought would be a quick payday became a drawn-out nightmare. Getting access to Mark Schiller's money, properties, and assets proved far more complicated than they expected. But eventually, after millions of dollars had been transferred into their hands, they came to a chilling realization. Mark knew too much. He had seen their faces, heard their plans, and could tie back to them. As long as he was alive, he remained a threat. On December 10th, the final transfer cleared. That's when Daniel Lugo, Adrian Doorbal, and Jorge Delgado made a decision that would push the case into even darker territory. Mark Schiller had to die. The murder plan was simple: get Schiller heavily intoxicated, put him behind the wheel of his own vehicle, stage an accident. For days, they forced alcohol down his throat. The constant drinking left him violently ill, but refusing wasn't an option. By December 14th, he had reached what appeared to be the final day of his captivity. His unconscious body was loaded into his own forerunner. Lugo ordered him to take sleeping pills and wash them down with massive amounts of liquor. The objective was painfully clear. They wanted to erase the image of who Mark Schiller really was. Lugo climbed into the passenger seat, accelerated toward a concrete utility pole, and jumped out moments before impact. The crash happened exactly as planned. The problem was that Schiller survived. Realizing he was still alive, the crew escalated. Gasoline was poured onto the vehicle. The vehicle was set on fire. Somehow, incredibly, Schiller managed to escape the burning wreck. The gang panicked. Their victim was still alive. They ran him over with the vehicle in an attempt to finish the job. And somehow, against every possible odd, he survived that too. He eventually made it to a hospital, but even then, the nightmare wasn't over. When he told police what had happened, many investigators dismissed his story. To them, it looked like a bizarre drunk driving accident. Desperate and running out of options, Schiller reached out to a private investigator named Ed Du Bois. That decision would change everything, because unlike everyone else, Du Bois listened. And once he started digging into Daniel Lugo and the Sun Gym crew, the entire operation slowly began to unravel. After Mark Schiller somehow survived everything the Sun Gym crew threw at him, most people would assume the gang would have gone into hiding. Not these guys. Instead of laying low, they practically moved into Schiller's life. They took over his house, enjoyed his money, threw parties, and soaked up every luxury they could get their hands on. For a while, it probably felt like they had beaten the system. But stolen money has a way of disappearing fast. Before long, the cash started drying up, and the crew found themselves facing a familiar problem. They needed another victim. That's when Frank Griga entered the picture. Griga was the kind of success story people dream about. Originally from Hungary, he came to America chasing opportunity and actually found it. After settling in South Florida, he built a highly profitable phone sex hotline business that made him a millionaire. By the mid-1990s, he was living comfortably and enjoying the rewards of his hard work. He also shared his life with Christina Furton, a beautiful Hungarian immigrant who had been his girlfriend for several years. Then, in May 1995, everything fell apart. The first sign that something was wrong came when a Florida state trooper spotted a bright yellow Lamborghini abandoned near the Everglades. That wasn't the kind of vehicle people simply forgot about. When investigators traced the car back to Griga, they quickly learned something alarming. The millionaire and his 23-year-old girlfriend had already been reported missing 3 days earlier. The situation only got stranger from there. Their housekeeper had arrived at the couple's home and found no sign of either one of them. The only thing left behind was their dog. That immediately raised concerns. The couple had been planning a trip to the Bahamas, but they weren't scheduled to leave yet. Even more suspicious, their plane tickets were still sitting inside the house. Friends knew something wasn't right. People close to the couple understood they would never leave their dog behind without making arrangements. It simply wasn't something they would do. Concern quickly turned into fear. A family friend named Judy Bartouche started making calls, trying to reach Griga and Furton. At that point, she contacted police and filed a missing persons report. She also gave investigators one very important detail. The last time she had seen the couple, they were heading out for dinner with 2 men. At first, investigators weren't overly concerned. Miami was a busy city, and it wasn't unusual for adults to disappear for a few days without immediately raising alarms. But everything changed when Schiller's Lamborghini was found abandoned. Suddenly, detectives believed they were dealing with something much more serious than a missing person case. They searched the family home, examined the vehicle, and followed every lead they could find. Yet, despite their efforts, they came up empty-handed. There were no obvious suspects, no clear motive, and very little evidence to work with. The only real lead was the description of the 2 men seen having dinner with the couple before they disappeared. One witness described one of the men as dark-skinned, athletic, handsome, and unforgettable. That description triggered something in the mind of Miami homicide captain Al Harper. He immediately thought about a conversation he'd recently had with private investigator Ed Du Bois. Detective Du Bois had been digging through Mark Schiller's case for weeks when he stumbled across something that didn't sit right with him. While reviewing documents tied to the transfer of Schiller's assets, he noticed that several had been notarized by a man named John Measy. That name immediately caught his attention. Measy wasn't just a notary, he was the owner of Sun Gym. The connection was too big to ignore. Du Bois headed straight to the gym and questioned Measy about the paperwork. Measy casually dismissed everything, insisting it was all part of a legitimate business transaction. But while waiting in a conference room, Du Bois noticed something unusual sitting nearby, a trash can packed with shredded documents. Most people probably would have glanced at it and moved on. Du Bois didn't. He gathered the discarded documents and painstakingly pieced them back together. What emerged was a gold mine. The paperwork pointed directly toward a network of individuals connected to Schiller's kidnapping. The evidence was so blatant, it almost seemed unbelievable. Despite this, police initially showed little interest. Many still suspected Schiller was involved in criminal activity himself and assumed the case was some kind of dispute between shady businessmen. Then, the Griga investigation changed everything. As detectives compared the two cases, similarities began piling up. The patterns looked almost identical. Suddenly, Du Bois's information became extremely valuable. Investigators took his files and started tracking down names. One name stood above all the others: Daniel Lugo. Right beneath him was Adrian Doorbal. Then came Jorge Delgado, the former associate of Mark Schiller, whose inside knowledge had helped to launch the entire scheme. Police showed photographs of Lugo and Doorbal to Judy Bartouche. Those were the same two men she had seen with Griga and Furton shortly before they disappeared. At that point, investigators knew they were on the right trail. The arrests came quickly. Doorbal and Delgado were located without much trouble. When detectives searched Doorbal's apartment, they found exactly what they needed: evidence tied directly to both investigations. There were blood stains. There was one of Griga's business cards, and there was a red leather outfit matching the one Furton had been wearing the night she vanished. The evidence was overwhelming. Faced with mounting pressure, Doorbal cracked. Once he started talking, everything came spilling out. According to Doorbal, the gang had targeted Griga because they believed he was wealthy enough to make them rich all over again. The setup was simple. They lured Griga and Furton to a meeting under the pretense of discussing a business opportunity. The chosen restaurant was conveniently closed. With nowhere to go, Doorbal casually suggested continuing the conversation at his nearby townhouse. The couple agreed. That decision sealed their fate. Once inside, the gang attempted to overpower Griga, but unlike previous victims, Griga fought back. The struggle quickly spiraled out of control. During the fight, Doorbal beat and strangled him. Griga died inside the townhouse. Meanwhile, Furton tried desperately to help her boyfriend. She never stood a chance. Lugo attacked her, and the gang eventually injected her with an enormous quantity of horse tranquilizer. The amount was so extreme that investigators later described it as enough to kill multiple horses. Soon afterward, she died too. The entire operation collapsed in an instant. The original plan had been extortion, but with Griga dead, the gang couldn't force him to transfer assets or hand over account information. The payday they wanted vanished. Now they were stuck with two bodies and a growing disaster. That's when Lugo called for help. One of the people brought in was John Raimondo, a Florida corrections officer who also worked out at Sun Gym. Together, they focused on getting rid of the evidence. At first, they attempted to use a chainsaw to dismember the bodies. That plan failed almost immediately when Furton's hair became tangled in the blade. Instead of discarding the tool, they actually cleaned it up and returned it to the store. Then they switched to hatchets. The bodies were dismembered, placed into large drums, and dumped in the Everglades. Griga's Lamborghini was abandoned. The remains stayed hidden for a while, but not forever. Eventually, investigators located the drums. The condition of the remains was horrific. Identification became incredibly difficult. Furton could only be identified through the serial number on her breast implants. Griga was identified using a single tooth. Daniel Lugo saw what was coming. Rather than stay and fight, he fled to the Bahamas. The escape didn't last long. Authorities tracked him down and brought him back to the United States. At that point, even Lugo understood the game was over. Facing overwhelming evidence, he began cooperating. In exchange for consideration during sentencing, he agreed to show investigators where additional remains had been hidden. Lugo led detectives to a canal in southwest Miami. What they found shocked even veteran investigators. Inside metal drums filled with tar and acid were the dismembered remains of Frank Griga and Christina Furton. But some parts were missing. Lugo refused to reveal where those body parts were hidden. Eventually, an anonymous tip pointed investigators toward additional evidence along Alligator Alley. The remains recovered there were so badly damaged that forensic specialists once again had to rely on implants and dental records for identification. By then, the full picture had finally emerged. The Sun Gym Gang wasn't a group of criminal masterminds. They were a crew driven by greed, ego, and the belief that they could take whatever they wanted without consequences. At the center of it all stood Daniel Lugo, a charismatic manipulator who convinced people to follow him down a path that ended in kidnapping, torture, extortion, and murder. Eventually, justice caught up with him. In October, Lugo pleaded guilty to dozens of criminal charges and received a death sentence. Adrian Doorbal was also convicted and sentenced to death, though his death sentence was later overturned years afterward. Other members of the crew faced lengthy prison sentences for their roles in the crimes. As the dust settled, 7 members of the Sun Gym Gang ended up behind bars. What started as a group of bodybuilders chasing fast money had transformed into one of the most bizarre and brutal criminal cases in Florida history. And in the end, the empire Daniel Lugo spent years building collapsed under the weight of its own greed.